As the pioneer of sci-fi thrillers, the Alien franchise is without a doubt the childhood nightmare of countless viewers. And Alien, Earth, as the first live-action series of the franchise, will for the first time fully reveal the terrifying truth of the Xenomorph race's arrival on Earth. The story begins aboard a deep space research vessel on its journey through the void. This ship, carrying 5 categories of deadly specimens from the dark sector of the universe, is now on its return journey. According to flight protocol, the crew awakens from cryogenic sleep every 3 months, sustaining their vital signs with special nutrient compounds. Because so many researchers had already lost their lives collecting these samples, and the rewards were so meager, the mood among the crew was bleak. Some even suggested hurling the dangerous cargo directly into space. Marrow, a half-mechanical synthetic being, always regarded mission duty as the highest principle. Just as the ship was about to enter Earth's orbit, the sealed chamber containing the alien specimens suddenly experienced a leak. Amid a rising chorus of screams, crew members fell one after another, and the ship was engulfed by red alarms. Yet Marrow sat calmly in the control room, methodically recording the disaster in the ship's log. When the last surviving female crew member stumbled to the door of the control room, pounding desperately for help, Marrow slowly stood, activated the plasma welder in his arm, and sealed the hatch shut. Then he returned to his chair and resumed recording. With a final piercing scream, blood splattered across the door's glass. The xenomorph killed her and then set its sights on Marrow within. Marrow continued his log. All crew confirmed dead. Course deviation detected. Impact with Earth inevitable. From the main hatch came a shriek of tortured metal as the xenomorph slammed its cylindrical crown again and again against reinforced glass, fractures spreading like spiderwebs across the door. At the moment the hatch was about to shatter, Marrow, expressionless, triggered a hidden mechanism and withdrew into a secure chamber deep within the hull. The sirens of collision rang through the vessel.
In T-minus 10 seconds.
The out-of-control ship scraped a space station's solar panels in low orbit, trailing fire as it plunged toward the blue planet below. In the near future, humanity's pursuit of immortality diverged into 3 technological paths: the mechanically enhanced cyborgs, the entirely AI-driven synths, and the hybrids, in which human consciousness was downloaded into bioengineered shells. Whichever faction triumphed in this race would command the resources of the entire solar system. Wendy, the first hybrid prototype secretly developed by Prodigy Corporation, was trapped in the body of a girl who would never grow. After her success, several terminally ill children would also have their minds extracted and placed into hybrid vessels. On this day, a runaway spacecraft fell like a meteor into the center of Prodigy Market in Neo-Siam. The military launched emergency protocols at once, deploying elite rescue teams to the crash site. Wendy's brother Joe, a dedicated member of the medical corps, joined the mission without hesitation. The shockwave of the crash obliterated the commercial district, leaving the streets strewn with the wounded and with twisted wreckage of steel. The rescue squad entered the gaping rupture torn by impact and soon discovered the emblem of the Weyland-Yutani Corporation on the bulkhead. As they advanced carefully into the dark corridors, sparks of strange energy flickered beneath the control room floor. Marrow used a plasma cutter to break open a hatch door and slowly crawled out from his hiding place. The ship's interior was a ruin, its walls splattered with dried blood, mutilated bodies of crew scattered in grotesque positions. The monitor screen lights up, showing the figures of the rescue team members exploring the ship. Marrow immediately activated his comms device. Meanwhile, in the underground control center of Prodigy Corporation, Wendy watched the catastrophe unfold via satellite feed. As Weyland-Yutani's rival, the Prodigy executives instantly realized the crashed ship might carry priceless research data. When Science Chief Cavalier proposed a recon plan, Wendy volunteered. Because hybrids surpassed human limits, they were the perfect choice. More importantly, her brother Joe was inside the ship.
Look at her face. Her body language, if I didn't know better, I'd say she was human.
I am human.
The revelation thrilled the executives, who approved the mission at once, sending several hybrids alongside her while ordering the research team to monitor their brainwaves and emotional states in real time. And in the biological laboratory deep within the ship, 2 rescue team members were staring in shock at the body lying on the floor. He did not die from impact injuries, but from gunshot wounds, clearly indicating intense firefight occurred here. From the ceiling vent, a sticky thread lowered silently. At its tip, A leech-like xenomorph creature writhed, sliding unnoticed onto one soldier's armor. Just as the two rescue team members are perplexed by the gruesome scene, Marrow leaps down from the ventilation duct like a ghost, his pulse rifle coldly aimed at them. The soldiers recognize the enhanced features instantly, clear marks of Weyland-Yutani's cyborg program. Marrow cuffed them to the piping, then turned and vanished into the shadows, continuing his hunt for the escaped alien specimens. At that moment, Joe's squad reached the stasis chamber sector, and the sight before them was horrifying. 10 pods stood in a row, but every occupant was now a lifeless husk. One pod's reinforced glass had been shattered outward, leaving a massive hole in the center, as if something had torn its way out from within. Joe bent down to examine the corpse, and by judging the color of the blood, he determined that these people had been dead for at least a week. While the team discussed this disturbing anomaly, no one noticed that in the corner, a damaged stasis pod held no crew member's body, only the shriveled remains of a facehugger. It was clear that one of the crew had been parasitized, and the deadly xenomorph larva was already long gone. The two soldiers chained in the lab were preparing to free themselves when one suddenly felt a strange, writhing sensation on his neck. Before he could react, the lurking creature had already slipped through the gap in his armor and into his helmet. The man let out a blood-curdling scream, thrashing his head wildly, but the slimy leech-like creature had already locked its jaws onto his artery. With sickening sucking noises, the alien swelled visibly, its translucent body showing the flow of blood within. The other soldier listened in horror as his companion's struggle weakened, desperately calling his name until the sound was abruptly cut off, because another leech creature had already crawled onto his helmet. Elsewhere, a soldier felt a chilling pressure at his back, and when he stiffly turned his head, a towering 2-meter xenomorph stood silently behind him. Its forward-leaning body cast a terrifying shadow. At that moment, the door of a nearby mansion swung open, and the owner, seeing the scene before him, screamed in horror. With one slash of its claws, the xenomorph tossed the soldier's body aside like a rag doll. Before the owner could react, the monster charged through the brightly lit doorway, and soon screams echoed from within the mansion. When Joe finally shoved away the corpse, pinning him down, the house had fallen into an eerie silence. He picked up a blood-stained pulse rifle with trembling hands, stepping over shards of glass as he entered the grand doors. The luxurious hall now looked like a vision of hell. Broken bodies scattered across fine carpets, blood trickling down marble stairs. Suddenly, a sharp crash of glass came from above, and the xenomorph smashed through the second-floor railing, leaping at him. Joe spun to flee, but a metallic tail wrapped tightly around his ankle. At the last second, a blinding arc of electricity tore through the air, and the xenomorph shrieked in pain. Through blurred vision, Joe saw Marrow step from the shadows, his stun gun still sparking. Joe staggered to his feet, trying to thank him, but Marrow suddenly swung the weapon around, blasting a surge of electricity into Joe's chest. In the final moment before losing consciousness, Joe vaguely saw Marrow switch weapon modes, a special polymer spraying from the gun barrel, wrapping around the xenomorph layer by layer like a living thing. The image of Marrow dragging the bound creature away was the last thing Joe remembered. Rewinding time to 1 hour earlier, Joe followed the Prodigy Corporation's rescue team as they entered the crashed Weyland research vessel. Bodies of crew lay sprawled across the corridors, and from the shadows came faint rustling noises, as if something unseen was stalking them along the walls. Inside a sealed cabin, they discovered a particularly horrifying body, its eye sockets empty, nothing left but dark holes. On a nearby screen, Joe found logs showing a vague recording of some unknown organism parasitizing the crew's digestive system. On the dissection table, the crew's chest was torn open, evidence that something had already burst out. The squad exchanged uneasy glances, quickening their pace through a breach in the hull that opened into the ruins of the city beyond. Lights flickered faintly through the smoke, and the captain decided they should regroup with the other rescue units. By now, Prodigy Corporation's aircraft had already arrived. In Prodigy's core laboratory, Cavalier stared at Wendy's brainwave readings on the monitor. They believed hybrid technology was the ultimate path of human evolution, neither cold and mechanical like Weyland's cyborgs, nor lacking humanity like synths. By perfectly transferring human consciousness into bioshells, they had achieved the truest form of eternal will. But Cavalier's ambition went far beyond, for he longed to communicate with higher dimensional intelligences. For this, he had prepared a quantum matrix for Wendy and gathered top scientists to train her, hoping to shape the first super consciousness that could respond to him. The sudden buzz of a communicator interrupted his thoughts. On screen, Weyland-Yutani Executive Yutani declared that the ship and all its research data belonged to the company, demanding their security forces be dispatched at once to take control. Cavalier smiled as he refused, claiming the crash site was still unstable. But once the call ended, his face darkened, and he ordered operations to accelerate, because whatever had made Weyland-Yutani so anxious must be of immense importance. Meanwhile, Joe and his team were descending a staircase when strange noises came from above. He raised his pulse rifle slowly, and out of the darkness a pitch-black xenomorph crawled from the vents. Joe had no time to aim. His instincts drove him to leap across the stairwell, but he slipped and crashed onto the lower platform. Gritting against the pain, he staggered into a safety passage. Just as the xenomorph was about to pounce, he quickly squeezed through the closing elevator doors. Sweat soaked his suit as he clutched the radio, trying to call his squad, but only static replied. Kirsch and Wendy led the Lost Boys hybrid squad, splitting them into two teams as they entered the ship. Kirsch's team discovered a bizarre life form clinging to the ceiling, half plant, half animal, writhing like some alien fungus. Through the live feed, Cavalier watched closely from headquarters. Lacking the equipment to contain it, they cautiously moved past and pressed forward. After several turns, they came upon the corpses of the two dead soldiers, with alien creatures still clinging to their bodies. On a dissection table lay the remains of a dissected facehugger. As they investigated, faint slurping noises drifted from a corner. In the beam of a flashlight, a black cat was licking a pool of blood. As Nibs curiously approached, the cat suddenly turned its head, revealing the other eerie eye. Before she could retreat, the swollen orb suddenly burst, releasing tendril-like nerves that lashed outward like living whips. The mutated eye's tendrils struck at Nibs's face. In a desperate instant, she threw up her hand to block it, the grotesque mass writhing furiously against her palm. With one hard swing, she slammed it onto a metal table. Smee reacted quickly, snapping a metal box over it. After receiving the report, Captain Kirsch ordered Toodles to stay behind and monitor the bud-like creature in the corridor, while he hurried to the lab. By hacking into the ship's computer, he accessed the flight logs, learning that the vessel had ventured into the dark reaches of space and returned with multiple extremely dangerous alien specimens. And all the signs at the scene indicated that these creatures had already broken free from control. At that very moment, Toodles was horrified to see the bud creature slowly blooming, a slender whip-like tendril extending from its center, swaying cautiously in the air. It showed no clear aggression, more like it was assuming a defensive stance. Kirsch sent a new order to Wendy through the encrypted channel, and the surveillance feed showed 6 oval-shaped objects neatly arranged inside a chamber. He ordered Wendy to lead her team there and join the others, and until the hazardous materials unit arrived, no one was permitted to enter or leave that area. Meanwhile, Marrow was pushing a xenomorph wrapped in special polymer into a cargo elevator, only to be intercepted by a squad of heavily armed rescue soldiers. He immediately pretended to be a panicked survivor. But at that critical moment, the restrained xenomorph suddenly convulsed violently. The soldiers raised their weapons at once, ordering Marrow to put up his hands. Marrow glanced at the rifles inside the elevator, helplessly lifted his arms, and in a hoarse voice warned them that they were making a deadly mistake. The squad leader recognized the cyborg modifications on Marrow, and instead of easing their guard, he signaled for his men to cuff him. As Marrow turned his back, the restraints on the floor suddenly burst apart, and the freed xenomorph lunged at the nearest soldier with lightning speed. Cold sweat formed on Marrow's brow, but just as he braced for a last stand, a soldier's shout from the corridor drew the creature away. New screams echoed from the passage, and when Marrow turned back again, the space had already become a blood-soaked slaughterhouse. At the same time, Wendy finally found Joe unconscious in a collapsed chamber. She had just received an urgent transmission from Kirsch, ordering them to head immediately to the chamber where the xenomorph eggs were kept. When they forced the door open, what came into view were 6 neatly arranged xenomorph eggs. Sensing that its incubation nest had been intruded, that xenomorph was returning at an astonishing speed. Joe stepped curiously toward one of the eggs, but luckily the facehugger inside was not fully developed. Just as they were about to report the situation, the xenomorph dropped from above, slamming Joe to the ground with such force that they both crashed into the chamber below. Wendy told Slightly to stay and guard the incubation room while she descended alone to rescue her brother. Pinned beneath the xenomorph and badly injured, Joe struggled when suddenly Wendy appeared, hooking the creature's jaws with an iron hook. Using the hybrid's unnatural strength, she wrenched the xenomorph off him. While controlling the struggling xenomorph, she told Joe to quickly go to the nearby airlock and prepare to close the door. The xenomorph writhed like a dog caught by the head, but Wendy dragged it step by step toward the chamber. Just as Joe hit the switch and the airlock doors began to close, the creature's jaws snapped free. Caught off guard, Wendy was tightly wrapped by the xenomorph's swift tail and dragged into the dark inner room. The airlock filled with the sounds of violent struggle and impact. Joe, ignoring his wounds, rushed to reopen the hatch, but inside there was only silence. Grabbing a flashlight, he shone it into the chamber, revealing the xenomorph torn apart, green blood hissing as it corroded the metal floor. Wendy stood motionless nearby, a small knife dripping with slime in her hand. She slowly turned to Joe, and white mucus actually began to drip from her forehead. Joe struggled to step forward to check Wendy's injuries, but he himself had previously been pierced by the xenomorph, and with severe injuries, he could no longer hold on, eventually slowly collapsing beside his sister. Elsewhere, Slightly remained terrified while guarding the xenomorph eggs, until he saw Smee arrive on Kirsch's orders and felt some relief. Marrow suddenly appeared with his weapon in hand, suspicious of the fact that they were completely unarmed. Slightly explained that their group of hybrids was still in a secret development stage, strictly forbidden to carry weapons. Although they have adult bodies, their inner consciousness remains as innocent as children. After transmitting all mission data back to Weyland-Yutani, Marrow demanded to know what kind of biotechnological beings they were, but Kirsch arrived just in time. Kirsch learned the truth about the ship from the server, and he confronted Marrow. Marrow tried to protect the xenomorph eggs, but as a cyborg of Weyland-Yutani, even he could not resist the threat of facehugger infestation. Weighing the risk, he chose to retreat. Marrow secretly contacted Weyland-Yutani, but since the mission had lasted 65 years, the company's leadership had already changed twice. When he reported that rival Prodigy Corporation had secured alien specimens, Yutani ordered him to return at once, but Marrow refused. These xenomorphs were the result of his 65 years of work, purchased with the lives of the entire crew, and he swore he would reclaim them at any cost. Soon, the 5 types of alien specimens from the ship, along with an unconscious Wendy, were delivered safely to Prodigy Corporation's headquarters. Seeing the extraterrestrial life forms with his own eyes, Cavalier could not contain his excitement, and he demanded they be sent immediately to the underground containment lab. As Cavalier leaned too close to one of the xenomorph eggs, Kirsch rushed forward to stop him, sternly warning him away. The frozen tubes on the ship had all contained corpses torn open from within, proof that these creatures had gestated inside human bodies.
Like you.
The words snapped Cavalier back to his senses, and he immediately ordered the lab sealed off, access restricted to hybrids only, and command handed over to Kirsch. Later, Wendy suddenly awoke in the medical bay, disturbed by an eerie sound that seemed to call only to her. Drawn as if compelled, she left the bay alone. Meanwhile, Joe was undergoing emergency treatment in the operating room. The penetrating wound caused by the xenomorph had led to severe internal bleeding, and the doctors had no choice but to remove part of the damaged organs and replace them with bionic implants to keep him alive. Unconsciously following a sound that only she could perceive, Wendy made her way down to the underground laboratory. At that moment, Kirsch was leading the members of the Lost Boys squad in a detailed dissection of a xenomorph egg. When the facehugger was taken from the xenomorph egg and thrashed violently between the instruments, Wendy felt as if she could personally experience its pain. After stunning the facehugger with an electric shock, Kirsch picked up the scalpel and began the dissection, unaware that the other xenomorph eggs inside the glass chamber were quietly undergoing a mutation. Standing outside, Wendy clearly received waves of fear emanating from them. Kirsch extracted a leech-like living organism from the facehugger's body, the primal embryo of a xenomorph. He then placed the larva into a petri dish containing human lung tissue. After wriggling for a moment, it quickly burrowed deep into the lung, began absorbing nutrients, and grew at a rapid pace. At that same instant, Wendy convulsed uncontrollably, collapsing as her consciousness sank into darkness again. She later awoke in the lab, surrounded by others. They asked anxiously why she had fainted, and Wendy slowly explained she had heard strange signals from the alien biology lab and discovered that Kirsch was experimenting on the xenomorph eggs. Although her brother worried for her health, Wendy was convinced these beings had chosen her as their point of contact, and she was desperate to understand the message they were trying to send. Cavalier strongly supported her conviction. After repeated tests, they discovered it was a low-frequency signal, one imperceptible to the human ear. To Cavalier's surprise, not even the other hybrids could sense this frequency. Cavalier eagerly suggested that Wendy try using her special hybrid body to reproduce that sound, materializing it like playing a piece of music. To their astonishment, Wendy succeeded on her very first attempt. Later, Adam confided his concerns to Cavalier. When a hostile alien species suddenly attempts to communicate, humanity must be wary of their intentions. He urged that the alien specimens be turned over to Weyland-Yutani, stressing that Prodigy Corporation's true focus was immortality of consciousness, not biotechnology, and that they should not venture too far into unknown risks. But Cavalier refused, half joking that he would never want to wake up one day with a xenomorph bursting from his stomach. He then ordered Adam to keep Wendy's brother Joe at headquarters, believing Joe might hold irreplaceable value in future plans. Prodigy Corporation soon launched experiments on a second type of alien organism. This time the subject was a live goat covered in electrodes monitoring brain activity. After the experiment began, the alien creature Trypanohincha ocellus, which resembled a fusion of an eyeball and tentacles, crawled out of the pipeline and entered the room where the goat was confined. Sensing a potential host, it advanced quickly. The goat backed away in terror, but there was nowhere to run. T. ocellus suddenly leapt onto its face, its tentacles gouging out the eye before burrowing into the empty socket. After collapsing briefly, the goat's eyes rolled unnaturally. Immediately after, the parasitized goat, under the stunned gaze of everyone present, rose upright in a way that defied its physiology and slowly turned toward the humans standing outside the glass door. The monitors showed brainwave activity completely altered, with gamma waves linked to higher cognition spiking dramatically. This meant the creature was a life form of advanced intelligence. Humans observed them as test subjects, but in truth they were observing humanity in their own way. Cavalier was shaken to his core. No longer content to be only a researcher, he yearned to become someone who could truly communicate with these beings, just as Wendy had connected with the Xenomorphs. Arthur quietly led his wife outside the laboratory, his expression grave as he voiced his concerns. He insisted the company should not continue studying such dangerous organisms, for this was far beyond their field, and if an experiment went out of control, the consequences could be irreversible. While they whispered, Nibs strolled up humming a light-hearted tune.
I have good news. Such good news. I'm pregnant. I'm gonna have a baby.
What?
No, that's impossible. You're a machine.
I'm not a machine. Why would you say that?
Dame Sylvia, head of the hybrid program, hurried to explain the natural human processes of pregnancy and birth, but Nibs stubbornly insisted that she herself was already pregnant. When Sylvia tried to ask why she believed this, Nibs suddenly lost control, leaping up and clamping her hands around Sylvia's throat. Dame Sylvia forced herself to stay calm, using a gentle tone to shift the topic. Nibs released her grip and returned to her usual state as if nothing had happened. Sylvia caught her breath, but she now realized the hybrids carried hidden flaws. She did not know that a hybrid girl had once tried to win Cavalier's favor, attempting to take Wendy's place. Now Nibs was showing the same strange delusions and abnormal behavior. Seizing the moment while making tea, Sylvia pressed a concealed alarm button. Security rushed in, and once Nibs had left, she gravely ordered them to stay alert. After the ship crashed, Weyland-Yutani's Marrow, while talking to Slightly, secretly implanted a tiny communication device inside his body. Once Slightly returned to Prodigy Corporation's headquarters, Marrow began using the device to communicate with him. Although Slightly and the other hybrids possess adult mechanical bodies, their minds remain those of the terminally ill, naive children they originally were. Under Marrow's deliberate manipulation, Slightly gradually began to see him as a trustworthy friend, even revealing his real name from his days as a human. But they did not realize that every word of their conversation was being monitored by Kirsch. Soon after, Kirsch came to Slightly's room and pointed at the mural of 3 monkeys on the wall, asking in a meaningful tone if Slightly grasped the message it was meant to convey. Kirsch asked if he did something wrong, would Slightly choose to expose him.
If I caused others to be hurt, would you do something to stop me, or would you look the other way?
Marrow suddenly cut in, warning Slightly to be careful. After a long hesitation, Slightly finally said he would stand up for a friend. Kirsch seemed satisfied with the answer and left the room. Not long after, Marrow used Slightly's true name to track down his family, introducing himself as her son's friend and gaining the mother's trust. He contacted Slightly again, letting him hear his mother's voice, then used the chance to ask for a favor, to retrieve one of the alien life forms from the crashed ship. Terrified, Slightly refused. but Marrow explained he didn't need to steal an entire egg. He only needed to quietly bring someone into the laboratory and guide that person toward one of the eggs. Once the egg hatched, the creature would attach itself to a person's face, and after a day or two, it would detach on its own, leaving the person still alive. Slightly would only need to take that person back to Marrow. The cyborg agents of Weyland-Yutani showed, as always, no humanity. Though the company claimed to be building a better world, in truth they deceived child-minded hybrids, sacrificing human lives to steal alien specimens. Their true goal was to turn these creatures into weapons to secure dominance in the cosmos. But Marrow did not realize that Kirsch had already overheard their entire scheme. Yet Kirsch reported nothing to Cavalier. Instead, he went alone into the lab, running his hand across the shell of a xenomorph egg, his intentions unclear. Prodigy Corporation was no less ambitious. Though focused on synthetic consciousness and artificial intelligence, they had risen in record time, surpassing 4 established giants and becoming the 5th major power ruling the solar system, their influence stretching across Asia, Oceania, South Africa, and Iceland. Now that they had intercepted Weyland-Yutani's alien samples, Cavalier's ambitions grew even greater. He ordered Adam to keep Wendy's brother Joe under control, citing the high cost of his lung replacement surgery as a reason to keep him in the company's grip. Adam stressed that under no circumstances could Joe take Wendy away. Meanwhile, Cavalier sought out Wendy. Through their talk, he discovered her deep bond with her brother and promised that if she could decipher the alien language and learn what they were saying, Joe could remain by her side at the company. Wendy believed it and promised that she would do everything in her power to complete the task. Wendy then entered the laboratory alone and sent out low-frequency signals, which only the xenomorph could hear, toward the glass vessel holding Joe's removed artificial lung. Moments later, the larva hidden inside was stirred awake, tearing free of the tissue, leaping onto the table and staring at Wendy with newborn curiosity. Wendy continued to emit the signal and slowly reached out, touching its smooth, cold head. The infant xenomorph accepted her as kin, showing obedience and closeness. This became the first true communication between humans and xenomorphs. The scene flashes back to the moments before Maginot arrived on Earth. Marrow was suddenly awakened in his cryopod by Junior Security Officer Clem as the blaring alarm echoed throughout the ship. Clem told him a fire had broken out in the containment chamber. Though the flames had been extinguished, 2 alien organisms had escaped. When Marrow reached the medbay, he found Captain Dinsdale and Science Officer Bronsky both attacked by facehuggers, with Dinsdale already dead. When Medical Officer Rahim tried to cut off the facehugger's tail to save Dinsdale, the acid it released burned through his skull. As head of security, Marrow was more concerned with how the fire had started. Was it an accident or deliberate sabotage? Why had the containment unit for the xenomorph eggs been opened? Vice Captain Zaverny insisted that the lives of the crew had to come first. Chibuzo reminded everyone of the rule that had been set earlier. Any crew member exposed to alien organisms must be placed into cryogenic sleep until the mission ended. At that moment, there were still 15 days left before reaching Earth, which meant Bronsky and the facehugger attached to his face would have to remain frozen until the journey was over. Zaverny ordered the crew to follow the rule and sent people to check the containment bay to see if any other creatures had escaped. Marrow, however, learned a troubling secret from Engineer Shmuel. The fire had destroyed the navigation system and engine relays, which meant the ship was now nothing more than a missile headed straight for Earth. Marrow went to Zaverny, urging her to declare a full emergency so he could begin his investigation, convinced someone had sabotaged the vessel. But Zaverny argued such an announcement would cause mass panic and said she would first consult the central computer. Marrow suddenly brought up Bronsky, pointing out that the company forbade relationships between crew members, yet Zaverny had secretly gotten involved with him. If Zaverny allowed her feelings to cloud her judgment, Marrow threatened to strip her of acting captain authority. Zaverny's duty was to protect the crew's welfare and safety, while Marrow's duty was to ensure the cargo reached Earth intact. The company's regulations were clear, crew lives were secondary. Elsewhere, Rahim and Adam had already sealed Bronsky inside a cryopod. Rahim lamented that this space parasite proved humanity's foolishness, smart enough to build ships and split atoms and decode genomes, yet too foolish to understand they should never bring parasites back home. Weyland-Yutani's true motive was not equality with the other 4 companies. If they obtained these samples, they could reshape the balance of power across the world and control everything. As Rahim finalized the cryo process, he noticed Mr. Ting standing before another pod, gazing longingly at the sleeping woman inside. Marrow, meanwhile, investigated the fire's origin, finding a massive acid-burned hole in the deck plates. He went to the monitoring room to retrieve the footage from that moment and saw the fire suddenly erupting, with Dinsdale and Bronsky rushing to put it out after hearing the alarm. But they failed to notice that behind them, 2 facehuggers had crawled out of the containment case, holding the xenomorph eggs. Caught off guard, both men were instantly attacked. and rendered unconscious. Marrow kept rewinding the feed and eventually spotted a figure hiding in a blind spot of the camera, deliberately opening the container. But only the person's back could be seen. Later, Zaverny visited the cryobay to check on her lover. As she turned to leave, the facehugger inside Bronsky's pod twitched faintly, proving it had not been frozen with him. Zaverny reported to the ship's AI, recommending that all alien specimens aboard be destroyed to protect the crew. The AI refused, declaring the samples were the top priority, and warned that if she disobeyed, Marrow would take command as acting captain. Back in his cabin, Marrow pulled out a letter from his daughter. He had joined Weyland-Yutani's dangerous deep space program, only to pay for her education. But 12 years after he left, she had perished in a fire. What awaited him was the return to Earth 53 years later to reclaim his daughter's belongings. Reading the telegram, Marrow broke down in tears. The next day, as they debated how to repair the navigation system, the alarms blared again. Racing to the cryobay, they found Bronsky's pod shattered, a massive hole in the glass, proof the xenomorph larva had hatched and torn free. Meanwhile, Chibouzo dropped a dead rat into a jar to feed the leech-like specimens. She watched them feed, unaware that, in the next tank, the Trypanohincha ocellus was watching her every move. Chibouzo was recording the feeding changes of the leech samples, but she didn't notice that one leech had climbed to the top of the glass jar and was twisting the lid open with its tiny tendrils. The T. ocellus saw this and tapped its own tank to draw Chibouzo's attention, allowing the leech specimen to crawl onto the desk. Chibouzo placed the glass jar containing T. ocellus back into the wall's mounting slot, but the leech sample on the table had already crept silently onto her water cup and laid its eggs inside. Afterward, the leech crept toward her sandwich, but Rahim arrived in time to spot it. His startled cry also caused her to fail to fully secure the glass jar containing T. ocellus. Rahim grabbed the leech with tongs and dropped it back into its jar, then told Chibouzo the captain had summoned everyone to the kitchen. Chibouzo hastily placed the leech sample's glass jar into the slot, then took the cup full of insect eggs and followed Rahim to the kitchen. But she never noticed that the T. ocellus jar was not properly sealed. The creature began striking the glass with its long tendrils. In the dining hall, Zaverny openly revealed the dire situation the ship was facing. The xenomorph juvenile had vanished to an unknown location, and there was a traitor on board sabotaging the mission. Startled, apprentice engineer Malachite choked on his food, then reached for a nearby cup and drank deeply. But he had no idea that Chibouzo's water cup was full of leech larvae. Soon after, while repairing equipment, Malachite collapsed, vomiting blood. Meanwhile, Zaverny and Chibouzo returned to the biolab, where they discovered the T. ocellus had broken free of its jar. They immediately sealed the lab doors. At this moment, Marrow was interrogating Mr. Teng, mentioning that he often woke up from hibernation midway, which made him highly suspicious. Mr. Teng explained that he only woke to look at a girl he liked, and he told Marrow that although the computer always showed the cryopods as occupied, that didn't mean they were always full. Obviously, there were others who had woken up while the rest of the crew were still in hibernation. Marrow checked the crew's communication records in the control room and finally uncovered the true identity of the traitor. It turned out that the chief engineer Petrovich had secretly contacted Prodigy Corporation, revealing everything about the alien samples on board. Cavalier promised that if Petrovich could force the ship to crash on Prodigy territory, he would be rewarded with a hybrid body. But when Marrow went to the crew quarters with a weapon, Petrovich's cryopod was already empty. Then the ship's alarms blared again, and Marrow rushed to the medbay, where he learned that Malachite had collapsed and 2 doctors were examining him. Just as Zaverny ordered a live dissection of Malachite, Mr. Teng, who was locked up, noticed drops of slime falling onto his head. He looked up, and inside the ventilation duct was the very xenomorph that had escaped. Inside the medbay, the doctors found leech larvae feeding inside Malachite's body. Just as they removed one of the larvae attached to his lung, the torn area suddenly sprayed a yellow gas, and the 2 doctors were immediately infected, collapsing while clutching their throats. Zaverny initiated a sterilization process for the entire medical bay. When the white mist cleared, both doctors were dead, but the larvae inside Malachite were still alive, crawling out of him. Zaverny trembled in fear, and Marrow took over ship management, taking Clem to the lounge to thaw all other hibernating crew members. But they were ambushed by Petrovich on the way. In the firefight, Clem was injured, and Marrow dragged him into a chamber without realizing it was the same place Teocellus had escaped from earlier. Petrovich shot Clem fatally, but Marrow managed to wound him in return. Taking advantage of his weakness, Marrow opened the hatch and lunged with a blade, stabbing Petrovich through the body. Before he died, Petrovich told Marrow that he was already unable to stop Prodigy Corporation from obtaining those alien specimens. Inside the chamber, several leech creatures crawled into Clem's wounds. At the same time, Zaverny was being hunted by the Xenomorph. She fled into engineering, only to find Shmuel already parasitized by Teocellus. When the Xenomorph failed to break the reinforced door, it turned away, and Marrow emerged from the vent. He forced the door open with brute strength and found Zaverny collapsed on the ground. He immediately raised his stun gun at the parasitized Shmuel. Suddenly, Shmuel turned his head and made a strange sound, then looked past Marrow. Teocellus had summoned the departing Xenomorph back. Now Marrow was caught between two threats. Marrow used the stun gun to incapacitate Shmuel, then directly escaped into another passage. But Shmuel didn't chase him. Instead, he lunged at the Xenomorph he had just summoned. He was clearly no match, and in the struggle the Xenomorph repeatedly impaled his body. At this moment, Zaverny woke up and saw that the Xenomorph had already pinned Shmuel to the ground, so she immediately opened the door and escaped. Just as the Xenomorph pierced Shmuel's body with its mouthparts, the Teocellus parasitizing Shmuel's eyeball suddenly burrowed out and jumped directly onto the Xenomorph's face. The Xenomorph struggled desperately, but it was no match for the agility of the Teocellus. Zaverny seized the chance to escape to the control room, but Marrow sealed the hatch to keep her out, buying himself time to finish recording the log. After that came the events of the first episode, where Marrow hid himself in the impact shelter below at the very last moment. Back in the present, Marrow arrived at Weyland-Yutani headquarters and told the current leader Yutani that he would kill Cavalier and reclaim the alien specimens. Yutani laughed it off, saying she was meeting Cavalier the next day with a team of lawyers to reclaim the samples legally. But Marrow trusted only in his own strength, determined to achieve the goal his way.
Whatever he wants, he gets.
Elsewhere, as the Xenomorph grew, Wendy tried to communicate with it. Joe watched anxiously, worried for her safety. Kirsch calmly pointed out that 5 centimeters of reinforced glass was enough to keep her safe. When Joe spoke of wanting to take Wendy away someday to live a normal life, Kirsch harshly cut him off. He reminded him that Wendy was a hybrid, and Prodigy had invested too much in her ever to let her go back to being ordinary. Kirsch's words only strengthened Joe's resolve. He quietly decided he would find a way to escape with Wendy. Joe went to Wendy, confessing that bringing alien life to Earth was a mistake. These creatures had evolved for millions of years in another world, possessing their own minds, their own feelings, and an innate lethality, perfect killers by nature. Wendy calmly asked him in return, was humanity not also a kind of killer species? In Earth's evolutionary history, mankind had also driven countless beings into extinction. Joe said no more on the subject, but whispered to Wendy that he was planning a way for them to leave together. Wendy only stared at him silently.
What if I don't want to go?
Meanwhile, in another lab, Dame Sylvia ran a full series of tests on Nibs, but found no physical abnormalities. She attributed Nibs' strange behavior to the psychological trauma from the earlier Teocellus attack during the rescue mission. After hearing the report, Supervisor Adam decisively ordered the erasure of all Nibs' memories since the ship's return. Because the company was about to publicly announce this hybrid technology achieving consciousness immortality in a few weeks, absolutely no mistakes could be allowed at this critical moment. Arthur refused to carry out the order, and as a result, he was immediately dismissed, told to pack his things and leave Neverland the next day. The following day, Cavalier led his team into negotiations with Weyland-Yutani representatives, and from the very first moment, he made his position clear. Yutani demanded the return of all property from the crashed ship that rightfully belonged to the company, but Cavalier firmly objected, pointing out that the crash had caused catastrophic losses to the city and even questioning whether it had been a deliberate act of sabotage.
Yeah, invasive species. Predatory. The Weyland-Yutani was smuggling onto the planet in direct violation of like 50 intercorporate laws?
When Cavalier seemed ready to present evidence on the spot, Yutani broke her composure and offered an additional $100 million to settle the dispute quietly. But Cavalier refused to compromise, demanding $2 billion. Helpless, Yutani agreed. Just when she thought the deal was done, Cavalier invoked the Alien Containment Act, which required all unknown alien organisms discovered by humans to undergo a minimum 6-week quarantine before any transfer could occur. Furious, Yutani raised her offer to $5 billion, demanding immediate delivery. But Cavalier rejected her again, stating that Earth's safety was not negotiable.
They don't belong to you.
Well, they're living creatures. I mean, technically they don't belong to anyone.
After the negotiations broke down, Yutani knew legal avenues were hopeless and decided to adopt Marrow's plan to seize the Xenomorph by force. Marrow then contacted Slightly on Neverland, threatening his mother's safety and forcing him to accelerate his mission while Cavalier and Kirsch were away. Slightly finally chose Joe, Wendy's brother, as the target for parasitism, but before he could act, Joe was called away by Rashidi. When Joe cautiously asked Rashidi about the ships at the dock, it immediately aroused the suspicion of the mercenary Siberian, and she sternly warned him not to act rashly. Wendy once again stepped into the sample chamber to communicate with the Xenomorph, now enjoying the strange connection, and to her shock, the once small hatchling had already grown into a full adult. Meanwhile, on his return flight, Kirsch secretly contacted Toodles, instructing him to feed the alien specimens in the lab. When Toodles entered the chamber, the sheep parasitized by Teocellus was staring at him with unblinking intensity. From the feeding setup, it was clear these creatures had very different diets. The parasitized sheep received tufts of grass, and in another enclosure, D. Plumbicare was being fed raw chunks of meat. The feeding mechanism here had clearly enhanced safety measures, minimizing direct contact with the alien creatures. In the third enclosure, a dark nest hung from the ceiling, and Toodles had prepared a tray of assorted metallic ores for it. However, an accident happened again. The feeding chamber door suddenly jammed, and when Toodles pulled hard, he accidentally tore the entire door off. The sheep next door grew visibly excited at the sight. Toodles operated the computer to open the isolation chamber door and decided to step inside to place the food himself. As he crouched and lowered the plate, the sheep suddenly rammed its glass enclosure, the thunderous noise startling him into hitting the door release. The reinforced door slammed shut, trapping him inside. Before he could react, a buzzing creature emerged from the nest above. One of the fly-like aliens that fed on metal, and this time, they regarded Toodles as their new meal. While searching for his sister, Joe encountered Arthur, recently fired. Learning of Joe's plan to take Wendy and escape Neverland, Arthur quietly revealed the passcode for the docked ships and remotely disabled the tracking device inside Wendy. Shortly after Joe left, Arthur suddenly noticed Toodles' signal had disappeared, last located in the alien creature sample room. He hurried there immediately. At the entrance of the sample chamber, Slightly sat in helpless despair, tormented by the task of saving his mother, not knowing where he could find a host. At that moment, Arthur arrived, and even unlocked the code lock of the sample chamber. Inside, Arthur was horrified to find Toodles lying within the enclosure, his face horribly corroded. He dashed to the console to open the lock, not realizing that Slightly had quietly released the xenomorph egg chamber behind him. The egg instantly detected Arthur's presence. At that moment, Arthur was trying to rescue Toodles before the creature stirred, but he discovered that the xenomorph egg had already opened, and a facehugger had quietly crawled out. Arthur sensed danger, turned to escape, but found the sample room door firmly locked by Slightly.
Here's my family. I have a family too.
At that moment, the adult xenomorph and the parasitized sheep in the room were intently watching this scene. Arthur barely raised his communicator before the facehugger sprang onto his face. And this horrifying scene was all monitored in real time by Kirsch, who was still on the plane.
Everything okay?
Affirmative.
He calmly responded to Cavalier's inquiries. Slightly dragged the unconscious Arthur into the ventilation duct, but he failed to notice that a glass door was blocked by Toodles' corpse, and a fly-like creature quietly flew out from its nest. The acid it spit could corrode various metals, and the metal grating of the ventilation shaft clearly couldn't stop it. Cavalier held up his hand before the sheep that had been parasitized by Teocellus.
Because pi.
Yeah, it's the ratio of a circle's circumference to its diameter. All advanced civilizations would know this figure, so... What are the next three numbers? And the next number?
Pi was not a human invention, but a mathematical and physical constant, deeply rooted in the fundamental structure of the universe. As long as a civilization had the concept of a circle or a sphere, you would discover a remarkable phenomenon. The ratio of any circle's circumference to its diameter remained a fixed constant, unchanged by the circle's size, and that constant was pi. So if one day humanity truly established communication with extraterrestrial civilizations, pi would very likely become the first cornerstone of that dialogue. Cavalier had always been obsessed with the idea of communicating with higher forms of intelligence, and despite Adam's repeated warnings that these alien life forms might become increasingly difficult to control, he still insisted on ordering the search for a living human host for T. ocellus to parasitize. He believed that perhaps this could create a way for cross-species dialogue. The reason Cavalier valued T. ocellus so highly was because, upon returning to the lab, they discovered that it was this parasitized sheep that had triggered the previous catastrophic incident. Rewinding to several hours earlier, when Kirsch and his team returned to the lab, they immediately commanded soldiers to handle the escaped fly-like creatures. Just 2 electric shocks were enough to strip the insects of their mobility, and they were once again sealed inside reinforced glass containers. Cavalier was deeply grieved by Toodles' death, especially considering that the cost of creating each hybrid reached $6 billion, so he immediately ordered that no other hybrids were to enter the laboratory again. However, Kirsch pointed out that Toodles' death was not an accident, and he played the surveillance footage from the lab. From the video, Cavalier realized that the sheep parasitized by T. ocellus was the true cause of the incident. Although most animals could understand cause and effect to some extent, this sheep did not gain any benefit from its own actions. The real beneficiaries were the fly-like creatures. Why the sheep would behave in this way sparked Cavalier's deep curiosity, and he decided to isolate it from the laboratory for further study. Just then, Wendy entered the room and saw Toodles' body. Cavalier explained to her that it was merely an accident and that the situation was now under control. Wendy intended to inform the others of the tragedy, but Cavalier stopped her and even considered restricting her freedom. In desperation, Wendy let out an infrasound from her mouth to communicate with the Xenomorphs in the lab.
You can't just erase things.
Where are the others? We've got to get to them before her.
Kirsch walked up to the control panel and discovered that all hybrid tracking signals had been deliberately shut down. The one who had shut down the trackers, Arthur, was lying beneath Slightly's bed. Although Slightly had managed to take Arthur out of the laboratory, he still could not bring him safely to the seaside. When he saw the facehugger tightly clinging to Arthur's face, Slightly even tried kindly to give him water. But his action was interpreted by the facehugger as a threat, and it suddenly lashed out its tail, coiling tightly around Arthur's neck. At that very moment, the door was knocked, and in panic, Slightly shoved Arthur back under the bed, nervously asking who was there. Smee, sensing that his friend had been acting strangely and hiding something, ignored his protests and forced his way inside, immediately spotting a human hand protruding from beneath the bed. When he saw Arthur parasitized by the facehugger, the horrified Smee stumbled backward. Slightly immediately warned him not to reveal anything, and disclosed that his family was under Marrow's control, and he must bring Arthur to the seaside to ensure their safety. While pleading for Smee's help, Slightly also concealed part of the truth, claiming that all they wanted was the alien creature, and that Arthur would be released unharmed afterward. After a moment of hesitation, Smee agreed to help his friend. The two of them carried Arthur, cautiously avoiding the patrol guards, and just as they were about to leave the base, they ran straight into Kirsch. They were flustered and stammered incoherently, but to their surprise, Kirsch did not expose them and even pointed them toward a shortcut. Through the secure elevator, they could leave the base directly. Meanwhile, Wendy was still overwhelmed by the grief of Toodles' death when Joe came to her, suggesting that they escape the island together. Thinking about how the company always treated hybrids only as tools, Wendy finally decided to leave with her brother, but she insisted on taking the other hybrids with her, for she regarded them as family and would never abandon them. Wendy reached out to her companions to share the plan, but only Nibs agreed to follow, while Curly still believed that Cavalier had once saved him and refused to leave. Before leaving the base, Wendy used her special ability to remotely unlock the cells holding the adult Xenomorphs, and the staff inside the laboratory all fell victim to the Xenomorphs' attack. From this, it was clear that Wendy's mindset had already begun to change. Cavalier was questioning Dame Sylvia about why her husband had taken it upon himself to shut down all hybrid trackers when suddenly loud alarms rang throughout the building. As the guards scrambled to contain the chaos in the lab, Wendy and Slightly each seized the chance to escape from the base. On the island, Slightly and Smee encountered a patrol squad and quickly hid in the roadside bushes. After the soldiers passed, they discovered in shock that Arthur, who had been lying on the ground, had vanished. Slightly frantically searched around when suddenly a facehugger fell from a tree, terrifying both of them. For those familiar with xenomorphs, it was well known that once a facehugger completed its cycle, it would detach and die, while the host would lose all memory of the time it had been parasitized. Slightly lied to Arthur, saying that there had been a gas leak at the base and that they had to evacuate to the seaside. But upon arriving at the beach and finding no one else there, Arthur quickly grew suspicious. He realized that the two children had deceived him, and he prepared to return to the base to confront them. Yet after only a few steps, he suddenly coughed up blood, collapsing to the ground in agony. As Slightly stood frozen in shock, a xenomorph larva burst from Arthur's chest and darted swiftly into the nearby bushes. Slightly frantically tore at the grass to search, but it was nowhere to be found. It was only then that Smee realized his friend had lied to him, but by now, Slightly had fallen into obsession and madness, fixated on delivering Arthur to the appointed place, dragging his lifeless body forward. The two of them passed through a dark cave and finally arrived at the rendezvous point, where armed figures slowly emerged from the sea, led by none other than Marrow. When he learned that Slightly had failed to bring the xenomorph larva, Marrow showed slight disappointment, then immediately shifted to his backup plan, storming Cavalier's headquarters to seize the xenomorph by force. Yet what he had not expected was that his second squad, dispatched for the mission, happened to encounter Wendy's group fleeing from the headquarters. Surrounded, Wendy calmly warned them to leave, which only made the squad leader sneer. But as a strange sound emitted from Wendy's mouth, their smiles instantly froze. The xenomorph appeared like a phantom, swiftly slaughtering the entire squad with overwhelming force. Then, the xenomorph approached Wendy like a pet awaiting praise after completing its task. Wendy used her sound waves to instruct it to remain hidden and follow her in secret, and the xenomorph obediently turned and vanished swiftly into the dense jungle. At that moment, Marrow was leading his men, successfully avoiding the guards and infiltrating the Prodigy Corporation headquarters, only to discover that he had fallen into a trap carefully laid by Kirsch. What shocked him even more was that the xenomorph larva he thought had escaped had already been captured by Kirsch. It turned out that Kirsch had been secretly orchestrating everything, with the sole purpose of luring Marrow into his net. Meanwhile, Wendy and her companions reached the pier only to find themselves surrounded by mercenaries, men who had once fought side by side with Joe. As both sides stood locked in tense standoff, Nibs declared that she would rather die than return, then suddenly lunged forward and tore apart a soldier's jaw with her bare hands. Chaos erupted on the boat, while the soldiers on shore dared not fire recklessly, fearful of harming the hybrids, each worth billions. Just as Wendy prepared to summon the lurking xenomorphs near the shore, Joe suddenly covered her mouth to stop her. Siberian pulled his gun and fired at Nibs, a move that only ignited her killing instinct. In the instant before she could twist Siberian's neck, Joe pulled the trigger on Nibs. Joe's action of shooting Nibs crossed the one boundary Wendy could never forgive, for to her, the hybrids were like family. For her, the corporation's erasure of memories was already a betrayal, and now her brother's act was another form of betrayal. This double blow tore through her fragile heart, driving her further toward the abyss of darkness.
What did you do?
The escape plan of Wendy and her brother ultimately ended in failure on Neverland. Dame Sylvia came alone to the grave of Marcy, Wendy's original body, mourning softly with regret and sorrow. As she was lost in grief, a chilling hiss sounded from behind her, and the monstrous xenomorph emerged in silence. Faced with such a terrifying creature at close range, she was powerless to resist, and in despair, she closed her eyes, waiting for the inevitable end. Then, several bullets suddenly struck the xenomorph's body, forcing it to roar in anger and retreat into the grass, disappearing in an instant. The mercenary squad had arrived just in time, rescuing Dame Sylvia and escorting her back to base. Yet by then, Neverland was already drowning in danger on every side. Adam continued his report to Cavalier, admitting that they had virtually no means to restrain the adult xenomorphs. The spearhead troops were still sweeping across the island, but their numbers dwindled at an alarming rate, while the xenomorphs struck from the shadows, harvesting lives one after another. Their strength was still enough to suppress other alien species, but under mounting losses and pressure, new problems kept emerging, and Adam urged Cavalier to seriously consider retreating from Neverland. Yet Cavalier ignored all warnings, staring obsessively at Teocellus, trying to communicate with it.
I wish I could hear your voice. Things you've seen.
That really would be an interesting conversation.
In Detention Room 1, all the hybrids were imprisoned, but Wendy had no intention of waiting quietly.
All this time, we've been afraid of them. But I think they should be afraid of us.
As Cavalier watched the detention feed, the screen suddenly went black, and he called Kirsch for answers. At that moment, Kirsch was in the lab monitoring alien specimens, calmly reminding Cavalier that Yutani would surely send people to rescue Marrow, and that he needed to be prepared. But neither of them realized that their conversation was intercepted by Wendy, who waved her hand lightly to disrupt their signal. Cavalier could only order his subordinates to repair the surveillance. Meanwhile, Marrow awoke from his coma to find himself and Joe imprisoned in a cage, and his cybernetic arm had been completely sealed. Learning from Slightly that Joe's lung had also been replaced with an artificial organ, he saw Joe as a kindred spirit. As someone who had been through it, he coldly warned Joe.
When a corporation gives you something, there's always a price. Do you know what it is?
Everything.
Everything doesn't begin to cover it.
At the same time, a mercenary squad entered an elevator heading for the armory to retrieve heavier weapons to fight the Xenomorphs. But suddenly, the elevator went out of control, alarms blared, and the system launched a self-destruct protocol.
Cell 30. Not 20, not.
On the screen, the squad fought desperately for survival until Wendy merely flicked her hand, halting the sequence instantly, then switched surveillance feeds, calmly scanning through the rooms of the base. Marrow managed to take down the guard, and with his battered body, broke out of the cage. Joe too seized the chance to escape, frantically searching for Wendy's whereabouts. Marrow's first target of vengeance was none other than Kirsch, who had led him into the trap. He silently eliminated several guards and stormed into the alien specimen lab, slowly advancing toward him. Kirsch sensed something and spun around, firing, but the bullet struck the glass of the chamber holding D, Plumbicare instead. Kirsch, though powered by artificial intelligence as a synthetic, lacked true combat experience, and in close combat with the cyborg Marrow, he was soon overpowered. Marrow bent down to seize the fallen gun, ready to finish Kirsch, but at that instant, D. Plumbicare shattered the heavy glass and burst free. Even more unsettling, its form vanished into thin air as if cloaked in invisibility, leaving Marrow unable to track it. Taking advantage of his distraction, Kirsch countered, throwing him to the ground and locking his arm around Marrow's neck. From the monitors, Wendy witnessed it all, her mouth releasing an infrasound that summoned the Xenomorphs to storm the base. Still lost in the illusion that he was in full control, Cavalier approached the hybrid's cell, attempting to sway them with words, urging them to obey. But with a simple snap of her fingers, Wendy caused the doors to swing open under his astonished gaze. Cavalier's expression shifted, yet he remained confident in his unmatched intellect, stepping into the cell as he began to recount his past. He revealed that at 6 years old, he had created his own hybrid and used it to kill his abusive father. Now his corporation stood among the world's 6 largest conglomerates, its wealth and technology proving that eternal consciousness was within reach. And when that day came, he would stand above them all. And these hybrids of theirs were merely display pieces. If they behaved well, they could keep these precious bodies. Otherwise, they would simply be eliminated. The hybrids inside the cage, after hearing his words, revealed intense hostility. They finally understood that in Cavalier's eyes, they had never been human, only tools to be commanded and exploited. The bodyguard immediately drew his pistol in an attempt to stop them from advancing, but Nibs instantly lunged forward and pinned him to the ground. Wendy did not kill Cavalier right away. Instead, she wanted to play a cruel game of cat and mouse and began assigning tasks. She sent Nibs to find Dame Sylvia, Smee, and Slightly to deal with Kirsch and Marrow, Curly to eliminate the mercenaries, while she herself would go to Joe.
Nobody touches my brother.
At that moment, Joe was brought by Adam into Cavalier's chamber, with Adam claiming that Cavalier wished to speak with him. But when Joe stepped inside, the room was empty, with only a glass case standing open. It was clear that Cavalier intended to use him as the new host for Teocellus. Joe turned and saw a sheep staring at him. Sensing a more suitable host, Teocellus suddenly shot out from the sheep's eye socket, dripping with thick fluid, and launched itself at Joe. In a flash, Joe sealed himself inside the glass case, but the strange creature writhed against the door, trying to force it open. Joe tightly gripped the handle, preventing it from breaking in. Unable to break through the door directly, Teocellus slid to the other side and crawled in through the narrow feeding passage. Joe shoved the door open in panic to escape, but the creature sprang toward his eyes with deadly accuracy. At the last instant, Wendy appeared and struck it away with a single blow. The danger was not over. Adam appeared, knocking Joe unconscious and turning his sights on Wendy. As Adam mocked Cavalier for being a stubborn child who never listened, the fallen Teocellus slowly crawled back toward the unconscious Joe. Wendy reacted swiftly, kicking it away again.
I say what happens now. You don't get to hurt us anymore.
Hearing his sister's voice, Joe gradually regained consciousness, opening his eyes just in time to see Teocellus slipping down into the sewer. Wendy explained to him that Adam was also a network-linked machine, like the gates and surveillance systems of the island, all of which she could control. But inevitably, the conversation returned to Joe shooting Nibs. Wendy believed that her brother, like Cavalier, did not see them as human. From Wendy's perspective, however, her companions were human in the same way she was, a new kind of life, not the sickly self of the past. Meanwhile, Cavalier was still unaware that Wendy had already ordered his capture, and he was preparing to board a ship to leave Neverland. But as he turned, he found a xenomorph standing coldly in his path. It did not strike immediately, waiting instead for Wendy to arrive. Several soldiers rushed to his aid, only to be torn apart in moments by the xenomorph under Wendy's command. For the first time, Cavalier felt true fear.
I think I pissed myself. A little help. Get.
Elsewhere, Smee and Slightly entered the lab to find Kirsch crippled, his spine broken. Kirsch ordered them to tie up Marrow, but instead, Smee bound Kirsch tightly with the rope.
Just want you to know I didn't hurt your mother.
Soon after, that mercenary squad also burst into the area, but unfortunately encountered the invisible D. Plumbacare. Team leader Siberian was immediately wrapped and killed by it. Rashidi too was quickly knocked out by Curly. Meanwhile, Teocellus had crawled through the sewers and reached the shoreline, where it discovered Arthur's corpse. Without hesitation, it burrowed into his eye socket, completing a new parasitism. A strange and terrifying scene unfolded. At the same time, the Weyland-Yutani ship descended on Neverland to begin their mission of invasion and retrieval of alien specimens. But they had no idea that the surviving humans had already been imprisoned by Wendy and the hybrids, guarded by two xenomorphs, one large and one small.
Now we rule.
And so, Season 1 of Xenomorph, Earth came to an end. Wendy, with her psychic powers and control over electronic systems, had turned the hybrids from prisoners into rulers, seizing Neverland for themselves. Her actions grew further and further from human morality. Joe was her only link to the human world, but even that bond was changing. As Wendy accused, Joe revealed a subconscious belief that they aren't human at the critical moment, which was a fatal blow to Wendy because it negated her core self-identity. Wendy did not wish to become Marcy again, but she wanted the new world she built to preserve pure human emotions, like the love she felt for her brother. Cavalier's failure was not only due to arrogance, but also to a childish and absolute self-centeredness, twisted by his traumatic upbringing. When he entered the cage to boast of his past, it was like a boy showing off his favorite toy, expecting awe and submission, never imagining it would spark rebellion and hatred. He treated alien creatures as toys, the hybrids as precious collectibles, and when those toys refused his command, his first reaction was not caution but rage and confusion, like a child frustrated by a disobedient machine. Sitting on a throne built of wealth and technology, Cavalier believed himself master of the world. But in truth, his mind remained trapped in that room at age 6 when he killed his father, never truly growing up. The biggest highlight of the next season will be who becomes the final winner. Wendy and the hybrids now control both the alien creatures and the base. The Weyland-Yutani Corporation comes armed and prepared, but they may have underestimated Neverland. And the escaped Teocellus and D. Plumbacare could become enemies to both sides. In this coming clash between humans, cyborgs, hybrids, and alien life, who will be the last one standing? We can only wait for the next season to find out.